It is now my pleasure to introduce Professor Michael Greenstone. Michael is a Milton Friedman Distinguished Service Professor in Economics and the College at the University of Chicago. And he's the director of the Becker-Friedman Institute for Economics and the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago. Michael studies the global energy challenge, which requires societies to expand access to inexpensive and reliable energy while minimizing local environmental quality impacts and avoiding disruptive climate change. Please join me in welcoming Professor Greenstone.
Thanks very much, Juan. It's my great honor to be able to participate in this event tonight. The real stars are coming, but I thought I would say, just talk for a minute about, so I lead the Energy Policy Institute at Chicago, and as Juan just said, our work centers around confronting the global energy challenge, which is something that all societies face. And it requires every society to find a way to balance the urgent and critical need for reliable and inexpensive sources of energy while limiting local air pollution that causes health problems and preventing disruptive climate change. And to do that, what we set out to do when I came to the university and started running the Energy Policy Institute was made a very conscious choice to focus on three regions in the world. They were the United States, China, and India. And our view is that these are the most important places in the world for the global energy challenge. And that this is an area, energy and environment, like many others, where we're kind of all in this together. And each country can benefit the world and each other. And a key role for universities in all of this is that the best way to do that is by developing new ideas. And new ideas are kind of the lifeblood of finding ways to achieve this delicate balance. And they're also something that don't respect borders. Ideas jump across borders all the time. And so a lot of our focus has been on developing new ideas. We launched EPIC China in 2019 alongside a partnership with the University of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. This partnership has aimed to advance some of the world's most critical energy and climate challenges in a way that neither institute could tackle on their own. And since that time, it's been a very fruitful and productive relationship alongside and in collaboration with and holding hands with Chinese scholars. We've been uncovering important insights that I think are relevant for China and are relevant for other countries, the United States, India, and other parts of the world that are working to find a way to solve this global energy challenge. Just to give you a flavor of some of the things that have emerged in this research, we found that China's new automated monitoring technology for air pollution improves pollution data and transparency, and has increased Chinese citizens' efforts to better protect themselves by purchasing masks and air purifiers, and has underscored the central role that governments can play in providing their citizens with information that they need. A second thing that we found is that when the public has information about local polluters, they can participate in environmental enforcement through social media, and that's been quite effective. And perhaps most importantly, we found that China's strong efforts after declaring a war on pollution in 2014 have led to very dramatic improvements in air quality in China. And indeed, if these improvements are sustained, the average Chinese citizen is expected to live about 2 years longer. And that's thanks to about a 40% decline in particulate pollution. 2 years longer is really an enormous accomplishment. So all of this research allows citizens and leaders alike to make more informed choices. And it just would not have been possible without this hand-in-hand collaboration with our colleagues in China. And it is indeed the same spirit of collaboration and style collaboration that is needed at the macro level to grapple with the larger energy and climate challenges, which brings us to our conversation today. And so I want to introduce our really kind of rock star set of panel participants here. Jonathan Pershing is the Program Director of Environment at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Previously, Jonathan served as a Deputy Climate Envoy for the Biden administration and had a similar role under President Obama. Few people know the ins and outs of climate diplomacy better than he does. He was instrumental in successfully negotiating landmark climate change deals such as the Glasgow Climate Pact, the Paris Agreement, as well as a truly historic climate agreement between China and the United States. Zhao Jian is the CEO and president of the Energy Foundation in China. I've been fortunate to be able to work with him through the years. He previously served as a Deputy Director General of China's National Center for Climate Change Strategy and International Cooperation, and led international climate negotiations and collaboration, including the Paris Agreement. He also played a lead authorship role in IPCC reports. And finally, to moderate, we have Lisa Friedman. She is a star climate policy reporter for the New York Times, and we are very proud to say a journalism fellow at EPIC. Lisa has covered 10 international climate talks. She probably could talk for hours about them, and knows the issues and mechanics behind international climate policy inside and out. And so with all that, let me step aside and let's let the experts take over. Thank you, Jonathan, Lisa, and Zhao Jian. Thank you.
Okay. Well, everyone is visible, and I am so thrilled to be moderating this conversation today. I'm Lisa Friedman. I promise that I will not talk endlessly about UN climate conferences, and I'm sure that both Jonathan Pershing and Zhao Jian give me a run for my money on numbers attended. I'm very honored to be moderating this discussion. You have the bios of both our esteemed panelists. These two former negotiators for their countries are still deeply involved in climate policy, and this discussion about the United States and China could not come at a more important time. We are headed in November and early November into global climate negotiations. Once again, it's the 27th Conference of the Parties, COP27, in UN parlance, will be held in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. The climate negotiations come as Russia continues to wage war on Ukraine, and the world is grappling with the crises that are reverberating from that war, including a global energy crisis, impending famine in the Horn of Africa. And into that mix comes a relationship with the United States and China that is on the rocks. China has suspended cooperation with the United States over the visit by Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, to Taiwan. And as I'm sure our panelists will agree, the U.S.-China relationship, and as we've heard here already this evening, has been pivotal to the rest of the world moving forward on climate change. It arguably made the United States and China cooperation and statement together, arguably made the Paris Agreement possible. It elevated the Glasgow conference last year when they issued a joint statement. And so to discuss the way forward with the United States and China, Jonathan Pershing, Zhao Jian, let's talk about the way forward. Maybe, Zhao Jian, can we start with you? Tell us what the state of U.S.-China relations right now on climate change is, and why is it important for the U.S. and China to work together on climate change?
Thank you, Lisa, for your question. But certainly no need to say it is very, very important for China-US to cooperate in climate field. No need to say we are the top two economies in the world, and also top two emitters of greenhouse gas emission. That said, we should be also aware of the fact that US is the top one developed country, and China, the top one developing country, and these reflect the major components of the solution and effectiveness for the whole world to fight against climate change. Without the cooperation between China and the US, we cannot imagine where will be the way out for global climate solution. And also, if we record the history, at least in the past 10 years, of the global climate agenda development, it's very obvious China-US cooperation really made great contribution to this multilateral process. Especially myself, I experienced the whole process together with Jonathan and many other colleagues. The whole process of the Paris Agreement, the negotiation. And it is true, without the cooperation between China and the US, it will be, maybe we should, we have to take longer time to reach such a fantastic agreement, although it's very difficult, but we reach it. So this shows it is very important. But when you say the current status, unfortunately, I would say the current status is so poor, for the general bilateral relation, and these has very direct spillover effects on the cooperation of climate. So we should find some solution to figure out that. Thank you.
Yeah. Jonathan, the Paris Agreement is set. The United States has policies to address climate change. China has policies to address climate change. Why, in your mind, is joint cooperation, needed at this point? What is lost if the two largest emitters are not working together?
So thanks very much, Lisa. It's great to be here. I wanted to thank the University of Chicago for organizing this along with Peking University. I think that in some ways, in the absence of some of these formal conversations between the two countries, these informal opportunities for engagement are even more critical. So I think it's really, really quite important that this dialogue is going forward, and I appreciate the universities for helping organize it, and Lisa, to you for moderating it. Let me come back to the particular question you've asked, because I think it's the right one to ask at this moment. What kind of scenarios can we imagine? One scenario essentially is a fortress world in which countries all seek individually to solve this problem on their own. But almost all the analysis, and many people at the University of Chicago and in Peking, and Zhao Jian, his work at the Energy Foundation and at NDRC, I've done some work on this at the US government, we have actually not found a solution where that's successful. There are too many parts of our global economy that are intertwined. There are too many things that each of us need to make progress that require other partners to succeed. So if in fact we want to make progress at the rate and at the scale that's required, we can't do it by ourselves. And let me elaborate just on a few of the elements that speak to that. The United States was instrumental in advancing issues around renewable energy. These are issues that came up at the US Department of Energy's labs. President Alivisatos was running one of those labs, but we've got others in Chicago, which he's now responsible for as well. Things on some of the solid state physics that were developed, the US was a leader. Other countries took that forward as a policy agenda. Germany and Europe, among the most critical, where they developed some of the earliest policies to promote the adoption of renewable energy. And then China picked up the mantle and managed to substantially scale up the investment and reduce the price so that now things like solar panels are ubiquitous, available globally, and can penetrate into global economies without substantial cost. And in fact, with a reduced cost below what they would have been absent all of those interventions. We don't actually have all the answers yet. we still need to develop some of those technologies. So a model in which any of us tries to do this on our own is doomed to fail. And yet the climate change agenda is obviously critical. The urgency is obvious and growing. And the need for the cooperation therefore becomes more urgent, not less. We need to figure out how we do things like manage variability in our energy supply so we have reliability. All of us have to work on that. We have to think about new technologies, like can I capture carbon from the end use of industry? We all have to work on that. And unfortunately, we also won't even that way be able to do enough. We have to take carbon out of the atmosphere. We have to do direct carbon capture from the atmosphere, a technology that we understand is in its infancy, but we'll need every single asset we can bring to the table to succeed on. And the US and China are going to have to do this jointly, or we will fail. So to me, the solution here is collaboration, recognizing that we disagree, recognizing there are enormous areas of tension and conflict. This is not one of those issues that can be put aside while we try to resolve those. We have to work through those and work on this agenda.
So what kind of role can forums like these play? I mean, I imagine that there are a number of, and gentlemen, I hope you'll tell us, track 2, discussions among former government officials and people close to those currently in government. Are those still going on, and are those, if they are those discussions sort of informing governments, or are they simply just not able to take the place of real one-on-one discussions with negotiators and ministers? Zhao Jian?
Here, in fact, Lisa, you mentioned the matter of the relation between track 2, track 1.5, or track 1. But my answer is very simple. In this situation, track 2 will play very extremely important role. To keep the connection and the communication between people. People to people, academia to academia, business to business, and at least this can maintain the connection and to share information and to exchange ideas from the perspective of academia. And certainly the ideal result in those messages will be conveyed to policymakers, to governments, and will be helpful for track 1. So in this situation, track 2 is extremely important.
So
like this one, between University of Chicago and the Peking University, and between Hewlett Foundation and the Energy Foundation China, between experts, professionals, etc., etc. Yeah.
Jonathan, these are keeping the lines of communication open. Is this able to sort of fill the space for the moment between negotiators that isn't being filled by governments at the moment?
So I think we should be clear about its importance and its limits. It is an essential component of managing the interaction and engagement, and it becomes more important when the formal channels are stopped or halted or suspended. I don't think it satisfies, though. At the end of the day, there's going to have to be a conversation between the principals in both countries, the heads of state. Maybe that will occur on the margins of the G20. Maybe that will occur in other settings. We'll have to have conversations between those leading on the climate agenda. Perhaps that's Envoy Kerry and Envoy Zhao Jian. Perhaps it will be between others who play a critical role. The Minister of Energy in China and the Secretary of Energy in the US, or the Environmental Protection Agency Administrator and the MEE head in China. We'll need those because ultimately there's got to be a formal engagement. Having said that, there have been periods of interruption in the past. This is not the first time there have been some difficult negotiations between our countries. And these track 2 and other mechanisms to continue the dialogue have been essential. Because let's be clear, there are 2 things that you want to do. The first one is actually to figure out what you should do. Those are ideas that are not limited to partners in government. Those are ideas that can come from think tanks and from academicians and from experts in business, as Zhao Jian has said. Those have to be developed, and as those develop, they can be communicated. In both of our countries, that communication is ongoing. And then you need to have the exchange. How do you find areas of compromise and cooperation? In the informal dialogue, we can identify those. We can propose them, sometimes without the fears of there being formal retaliation or concern, because they're informal discussions. But ultimately, you have to get to the place where what do the two countries agree? Now, they can agree it in two ways. They could agree it bilaterally. That's been the mechanism historically. Or they could agree it multilaterally. And that may be the mechanism that we see in the next round. There may be areas where the US and China, joining with other parties in Egypt at the next climate negotiations, could find some common ground and advance their joint cause through a different process.
I'll give a small plug to the New York Times Climate Forward event during Climate Week, which folks can find online if they'd like to see. I interviewed John Kerry on stage, and as you mentioned, he has a personal relationship with Zhao Jian, the lead negotiator for China, and I asked him if there had been any back channel communication, and he said, well, there's been back channel outreach. I asked him, what does that mean? Have you been texting him? And Special Envoy Kerry said, well, no, I've emailed. And then he sort of turned to the cameras and said, I just want the Chinese government, if anyone is watching, to know that he hasn't emailed me back. So there certainly seems like there are efforts to continue to engage one another. I wonder if either of you think that a joint anything between the United States and China is possible at this stage out of COP27. Jonathan?
So I'm an eternal optimist. Of course it's possible. And I think the question of how things have changed in the last few months suggests there may be more room than there was directly following Representative Pelosi's visit. I think that the reason for it comes back to the kind of increasing catastrophes that are related to climate that we're seeing around the world. I think there's a recognition on both sides about the urgency. I think China has seen this in terms of the requests it's getting from its partner countries in the BRI community, looking at food crises, looking at energy prices, looking at real constraints. I think it comes out of the US interest in moving the agenda forward as it looks at providing aid to Pakistan, which was inundated with a flood that displaces 30 million people. I think you're seeing it in the pressure from other countries on both the US and China to move forward. So I'm personally of the view that there will be some mechanism here to re-engage. I'm hopeful it happens before Sharm. I'm hopeful if it doesn't happen before, it'll happen during that meeting. And I'm hopeful that a set of things that we might do informally between others could help open up the channel for something constructive.
Jay, are you similarly optimistic? What's your level of optimism?
I see the possibility there. Anyway, I mean, for G20, for COP27 in Sharm, those are multilateral occasion. And I mean, there must be some participants and leaders or principals from the two countries. They will be there in the same meeting room, in the lounge, meet in the lounge or cafe or etc. And they have to discuss the common multilateral issue there. So those are opportunity there. But I would assume if everything's okay, I mean, especially the potential, the political situation will be stable. So there will be opportunity there. I mean, that depends on the atmosphere. So we should create more constructive atmosphere for make those opportunities to become reality.
I'd like to take a step back a moment. You know, as we've all talked about, we're about to head into climate negotiations. Last year at COP26 in Glasgow, it was a big moment. The President Biden in the United States had taken the White House. The U.S. was back in the Paris Agreement. Countries were being asked to update their emissions targets. There was a lot of attention on that COP, a lot of promises made, a lot of pledges made. I was wondering if both of you could kind of talk about for a moment, how do you see this moment? What is this moment in climate change, presenting itself as? What is rising to the top right now? How should we be thinking about this upcoming set of negotiations? Jonathan?
I think it's a great thing to contemplate. I think we're at a different place than we've been for much of let's call it the last 25 or 30 years of the process. Over much of that history, the world has been involved in trying to figure out what its goals should be. What objectives should it set? It's refined them. It began with an objective of trying to avoid damage. That wasn't very well defined. That was the Climate Convention in 1992. It then defined a set of objectives that talked about emissions reductions from a set of countries, mostly those in the OECD. That was in 1997. You then got to 2015 and it decided, no, we have to do a bit more. We should try to get a target for temperature. We should try to stay below 2 degrees and everyone has to engage. And then we came to Glasgow and we decided actually even that probably wasn't enough. We should make stronger efforts because the science is clearer and the damages are clearer. We should strive to do as much as possible, really seek to hold temperatures below 1.5 degrees if we can. Although the goal wasn't formally changed, the expectation of ambition was raised. And at each of those, countries then said, all right, I'm going to try, I'm going to make pledges, I'm going to make commitments. The US has a reduction commitment. China has a net zero by 2060 commitment. Countries step forward and put their pledges on the table. We have those. We don't need to renegotiate those. Those are still right. But where we are today, how do we implement those? What are the barriers to making real what those pieces of paper have set? And I would say a few things have to happen. We know how to do some things quite well. We know how to reduce some of our fossil fuel consumption. We know how to develop more renewable capacity. We know about electric vehicles. We're not quite so sure about steel and cement, but we have some ideas. We're less sure still about how to manage agriculture. We have some ideas there, but they're harder and more difficult to implement. But combined, we have not yet got a process that gets us to net zero. On the US side, you've got this massive new commitment, this announcement that was made only a month or so ago from Congress, setting us up with a new bill with $370 billion in emissions reductions. That's coupled with a major infrastructure announcement and incorporates before that a science announcement and before that an energy policy announcement. In China, you've got this 1+N proposal looking to begin to set concrete policies against the targets set by President Xi and the Chinese government. But in both cases, the details remain to be seen. We have to implement. This is a moment that moves us away from goal setting and into implementing. And we're just at the start of that journey, but we have to do it pretty fast to stay on a reasonable trajectory.
Thank you. Jay, how do you see this moment? What is COP27 about for the Chinese government, for people that you speak to in China?
In fact, I'm not in the position to talk what Chinese government's position, but as an observer outside, I would say my understanding is we should enhance the implementation of our pledge made before. So as Jonathan said, we have set up a lot of goals or pledge or targets already. We have had our NDC targets already, and then I think we are stepping into a new cycle of the negotiation. That the emphasis, the priority should be looking at to which extent we can achieve our targets and what barrier, what obstacles we will have, and what we can learn from each other. for implementation, including, for example, technological roadmap, investment, policy system, etc., etc. And then we can exchange. For example, recently, U.S. Congress just passed the Information Reduction Act. So we saw a lot of similarity from Chinese practice in the past decades for renewable, for electric vehicles. And then, but one thing I'm very curious or very interested in, and this is something for the coming decades in the US. But in China, we have experienced, for example, subsidized to electric vehicle in past years, and this year will be the end of the cycle of the subsidize. So then I'm thinking, should we extend our subsidize, together with US for electric vehicle? And what's the implication for the pace of electrification of transport? And what's the implication of emission reduction? What's the implication of competition in economic, in the market? So those are something we should concentrate more on. But certainly, I'm also aware of a fact, there are some articles there related to competition, especially related to China. And then let's think how to coordinate that. So as an economist, I welcome competition. I mean, healthy and rule-based competition. Let's coordinate the rule for WHO, for WTO, and bilateral and the domestic rules. And all of those issues should be addressed
Just
ahead.
to clarify, you're talking about some of the Made in America provisions that are part of the rules around electric battery sourcing that are in the newly passed U.S. legislation, right?
Yeah, I'm talking about that. I mean, but I said there are some similarities for domestic policies from Chinese side, and this is a big opportunity to explore that, to have a conversation on that, to learn from each other, in the view to enlarge the effectiveness of the policy. So I think those will become deeper and the most substantial topics for the negotiation or for conversation, rather than only focusing on target setting. But certainly, as a matter of cycle of the negotiation, and this will give the feedback for the next round update of NDC, targets. So, but certainly, hopefully, those will encourage us to enhance our target for the next round.
And yet, let me focus for a moment on target setting still. Is there any chance that you see that China will enhance its target this year?
I think the chance comes from the progress in implementation. If you have better and better implementation, cheaper and cheaper cost of renewable vehicle, electric vehicle, and you will build up stronger and stronger confidence, and then you will have larger and larger opportunity to update your targets. So this is my logical chain to make that happen.
But you don't see it happening this year for this COP?
I don't think this year, but this year can be part of the process. This is the process, but according to the Paris Agreement, legal cycle, for each 5 years, we will have an opportunity to update the NDC targets. So that means it should be around 2025.
Jonathan, I'd love for you to comment both on the Chinese target, if you think it's sufficient, and also the U.S. We'll get into the Inflation Reduction Act in a moment, but certainly, the U.S. target 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030. There are many that say that the U.S. should actually be going further, given its historic responsibility. And any chance that the United States, do you think, will increase its target this year?
So I think there's very little chance that that's going to change. I just don't see that in the politics for either country. I do think, however, that this question of where we are headed is real. Mm-hmm. And I would like to actually fundamentally agree with Soji. I think this question of implementation is pivotal. If it turns out that countries cannot comply with their current targets, they won't be particularly inspired to add to them. So in my mind, this is an absolutely central question that both countries will grapple with, and not just the two of us, but the world as a whole. I think the second thing which I'd note is that we're actually, we're a bit mixed here in how we're all doing. I think that there have been some real signals of progress around things like the price of renewables, but there's also been setbacks in terms of near-term energy security dimensions that have driven people back into coal. I don't think that's a particularly helpful signal for the world. And the open question is, can we overcome that, make that a short-term phenomenon because the price is driven further down and renewables becomes the alternative? I think we have to work on that. I think that question of rapid change is going to be one that could be offset by other circumstances which drive politics in the wrong direction. I want to come back to one other piece, which is this question of trade, because I think that's going to be an increasing area of potential tension. And I think it's going to be something we'll have to grapple with. The EU is worried about it. We're worried about it with other countries as well, not just with China. So there's a larger issue here that's at hand. But I do note that there's also this overarching question of what will it take for countries to take more domestic policy? What are the constraints that they face? What are the kinds of competitive advantages that they see? How do they overcome political objections and barriers? And one of the ways you do that is you find things that your country might seek to adopt and sell those things that way. The process is different in China, but the consequences are similar. If China doesn't see itself as winning from the policies, I don't think it will be able to adopt them. If the US doesn't see itself as winning from the policies, and winning takes multiple forms. It's the form of increased competitiveness, it's domestic jobs, it's economic well-being. These are not distinct to one country or another, but unless your policies can demonstrate that to your people, you can't sustain them. So how now do we overcome these questions of domestic development and global development? And I think this is a question we're going to have to grapple with. I don't think we've resolved that. I think if we assume that it only happens collectively, we won't move because there are real concerns about the domestic trade agenda. I think if we assume it only happens nationally, we won't be able to do enough because too many of our systems are intertwined. So I think this is going to be a negotiation between trade ministers, between in the WTO, in conversations around domestic implementation, but we shouldn't mistake that for the absence of progress or to assume that things will stop because we grapple with those tensions.
Zhao, I mean, the China's NDC, nationally determined contribution, its emissions target, it has pledged to reach a peak in carbon dioxide emissions before 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. When do you think that peak year will come?
In fact, this is a very classic question. So we also read the question to ourselves again and again. But certainly, I would say it's very uncertain, especially given the uncertain external condition. I mean, COVID, Russian-Ukraine conflict, recession, etc., etc. But essentially, I would assume this will fall. I mean, the peaking year will fall into the period of 15 5-year plan period. That's between 2026 and 2030. But that there are several determinants there. I mean, not only the emission itself, but also the GDP growth rate, and also the energy transition related issue like supply chain, price, etc., etc. Very complicated. But I mean, the most optimistic judgment is around, say, maybe earlier of that 15 5-year period. So 2026 to 2027. But if it will be later, I mean, in 2028 to 2029, I will not be surprised. But I think now the more important issue is not the judgment, but to create the better condition to make the Peking years come as early as possible. This is it seems to me this is the top priority for us. And let's forget the debate of which year you should reach your peak. But let's think about, what's the best condition? What's the better action you should take to make the peaking year earlier?
Well, and how high will emissions go before that peak happens is another important part of this, no?
You mean the peaking level? Sorry.
At what level will China's emissions?
At what level? So it's also uncertain. It's also uncertain, but I would assume maybe be around 11 or 12 billion ton CO2 or something like that. It might be higher, it might be lower, but it sounds to be around this range.
Jonathan, the Chinese government officially, at least on Twitter, where things can often be contentious, but on Twitter, reacted pretty coolly to the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, the historic climate law, the first major U.S. climate law. I think the China's Foreign Ministry account quote tweeted the U.S. ambassador to China about the new law, saying, "Good to hear, but what matters is, can the U.S. deliver?" What do you make of this kind of reaction? Is this skepticism warranted? Is it posturing? Is it a little bit of both?
I think it's unfortunate. I think that the model for engagement would be improved if there was a recognition that both sides are doing real work. I think that in my mind, as I have looked at this issue over the years, this represents a pretty significant departure from any prior effort in the US government. It has several characteristics. It's an enormous amount of money. The largest amount we've previously put into the climate agenda certainly came through the Recovery Act that was at the beginning of Obama, at the end of Bush. That is less than 1/4 as big as this. So if you start thinking about scale, this is an extraordinary scale. And one of the objections from the global community historically has been, well, we look at executive action, but we never see anything from Congress, so it doesn't have durability. Well, this was a congressional action. So I think that explicitly addresses the constraint that people have perceived. I think that one of the things that is clear, though, is that the US has been, let's call it a seesawing partner. Sometimes it's in and sometimes it's out. And with a country that's not as consistent, it's harder to take for granted that the things they'll do in one term will apply in a second term. So I think there's a legitimate question about implementation. To me, that's starting now, and we're starting to see some things domestically that suggest that there is an enormous amount going on. We're seeing it in 2 or 3 domains. The first one is we're seeing significant staffing at the federal level where the obligations to implement start. The second is we're starting to see states, which are likely to be the place for implementation, gearing up to manage resources and to think about their dimensions. And the third is we're starting to see investment from the private sector, which is obviously what we ultimately want, where people are looking at opportunity and looking at making corporate decisions based on federal potentials. None of that's very far along. The whole bill is only a month or so old, so it takes some time to put these in motion. But you're already seeing banks making different choices. You're seeing firms entering new markets. You're seeing decisions around future prices as projected by stock market equities rising on the basis of expectations. You're seeing a host of those things move, which give me a great deal more confidence. So then I come to the question of what's the upside for China? I think the upside for China would be much greater if China were more enthusiastic, because arguably there's going to be an enormous change in the system. Why would you push back? Well, you're a little skeptical, but you also don't want to be put on the spot. If what you can do is say, listen, we'll see it when it comes, then you can also say, and we'll get to our side once they've delivered. So it buys a bit of time. I don't think that holds. I think both sides are aware of the significance. I think both sides have made investments. I think that both sides, if they can ever get back together again, which I hope is soon, would be able to take advantage of some of the elements. And there are some clearly spaces where there could be work in common, maybe work in parallel, but work in common that moves the agenda forward.
Thank you. Before I go to Zhao Ji, I just want to remind folks I'll be going to your questions in just a moment. So if you haven't already sent them into the Q&A, please do. Zhao Ji, what do you make of the sort of early skepticism around the U.S. climate law? Do you share it? What are the conversations like that you've been having in China about the U.S. law?
But certainly for the moment, unfortunately, we can only see from internet, from media, but I'm very keen to have the in-person communication. But by the way, I will do that in late November and December. I mean, right after COP27, we'll visit to the States to see my old friends, academia, and the philanthropy, etc., etc. I think for the moment we should try to create more opportunity to have more and more in-person communication. It is very important. But for for agenda, I mean topics, I think for the moment we should focus more on investment issues and the fiscal and financial issues, because these can be a sort of integration. I mean, between climate agenda and economic recovery agenda, those can mobilize larger resources for, I mean, to avoid making some mistakes for our very urgent investment policy. For example, when we try to rescue the economy, which are the top priorities for almost all the country now, and where the investment should flow into. I mean, for example, renewable or electric vehicle or energy efficiency field, or to fossil fuel. So those are the options we have to make choice right now. And I think China and the US, we should exchange views on that, and no need to say trade issue might be more and more linked with the climate issue. As Jonathan mentioned, we should also keep talking on that, and to see in the coming years what we can do together in WTO, in G20, in COP, etc., etc. And then in that way, we develop our agenda to read the right question, timely question, and then to make the policy align with each other.
I'm going to take questions here. We have one from Kaushik R. A history question. How did the specific design of the US-China 2014 joint announcement and the 2015 joint statement contribute to increasing the momentum leading toward the Paris Agreement? What lessons did American and Chinese negotiators take from those accords when working on the 2021 Glasgow Joint Declaration? There's a lot of, let me see if I can give a helpful, quick background explanation to folks on this. Ahead of the Paris Agreement, the United States and China issued a statement in which both countries said that they would work to tackle climate change. And that sort of laid the groundwork for a lot of these other statements that the questioner is asking about. Let me turn first maybe to Jonathan to set the table here on how why these mattered.
So I think they were absolutely essential. I think they opened up enormous opportunity. They had huge influence, as the questioner is suggesting, but they had huge influence on the successful outcome of the negotiations. But that has to be taken in context. At the time of these negotiations, conversations between the US and China were moving along. There was something called the Strategic and Economic Dialogue that was in parallel. There was a 10-year framework that was being developed and under which there were negotiations on economic issues and energy policy issues and technology exchanges. And so in some ways, the circumstances were ripe for agreement. Those have since deteriorated. Those are no longer quite as productive. And so the lessons that we've got, I think, fall into two categories. The first lesson is that there are circumstances where the US and China can find common ground. We did it then when the circumstances were more open. We did it again when the circumstances were not quite as good while we were in Glasgow. So that's just a year ago. And I believe we could do it again now, even though still the circumstances are difficult. I think we have to pick and choose. At that point, we did things like an exchange on cities. We did work through the Energy Department of the US and the Minister of Energy in China on science and technology. Today, we may do slightly different things. We might talk, for example, about opportunities in things like carbon capture. We might talk about agendas that are around policy design for ensuring the reliability of energy supply when we use renewable energy, which is slightly more intermittent. But we probably won't do technology things where there's huge competition. We won't do things in which there's a perceived national security interest on either side. I think that still leaves real windows that we can engage. I think we have to find them. I think the Glasgow Declaration offers a few, some of which we could still move on. For example, the methane work was an area of agreement. We talked about doing work in forests and land use, where both countries are making real strides, and the exchange of information could benefit third parties. Agriculture and land use, after all, is almost 30% of global emissions. So there are real areas that we could still cooperate, which wouldn't be constrained by the disagreements between the countries. I think that's the lesson that I would take.
Zhao Jian, anything to add on your end?
Yeah, okay, thank you. I think we do need to record the history of the joint statement between China and the US in 2014. There are a lot of lessons learned and experience. We should think deeper. But I would say certainly the context is totally different. I mean, between that time and today. I would emphasize the trust level, political trust. I think at that time, the two sides, we have adequate trust level. I mean, from high level leader to working level, although we have very extreme debate sometimes. I remember very clearly, Jonathan and myself, we fighted in the negotiation. He said, oh, Zhou, do not concentrate on history too much. Just look at tomorrow, look forward. And I said, oh, we should consider historical responsibility, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, although we have different views for many things in the negotiation, but I trust him, he trusts me, and our leaders trust each other. And I mean, after meeting, we go to cafe, we have dinner together, we are friends. And so I mean, the context is different. No need to say for some fundamental issue, we have the shared vision, shared common ground, as Jonathan said. But today, I see, I mean, today's negotiator, they have more challenging condition to work together, especially for the political environment. And but that means we should try to require our politicians to leave adequate room for the negotiator to work together. That means they should control the trust level. Although we have some new emerging issue to debate, have different views, no problem. But never forget, do not make the trust level too low. Otherwise, there will be a very strong spillover effect on all the things, including climate issue.
We have a question from a PhD student from Peking University who asks, how can the US and China cooperate to mobilize those countries with wavering commitment like India? Zhao Ji, do you agree? Do you think that India has a wavering commitment? And more specifically to this person's question, can the US and China together influence other countries to do more?
But certainly, I think if China and the US can cooperate, and our cooperation is effective and smooth, at least this is a sort of showcase or demonstration to other countries. This is number one. Number two, if our cooperation can show more solution, more way out, more pathways, this will encourage other countries, for technology, for policy, for finance. In that way, I think our cooperation can encourage other countries, including India, and also create more opportunity to work with India together, to cooperate with India. For example, for solar, for green finance, for green manufacturing, for investment, trade, etc., etc. So I think this is the way for a better or healthy interaction between China, US, and the China plus US together with India.
We have a question about the energy crisis. Because of the energy crisis, the questioner says many countries are moving back to fossil fuels. How do you think about the long-term impact of these actions to the climate? Jonathan, let me start with you on this.
So I think the open question is, how long does it last? And I don't think we know. I think that's a really, the critical thing. If it lasts for only a year or so, and that the tensions subside, I'm not ever sure that natural gas prices revert to the levels that they were at before the invasion, but they may slightly recede, and some of the tensions around moving to coal in particular might be easier to manage. Having said that, there's also some incentives that are being provided because of these high gas prices, including in Europe, but also including globally, where countries are accelerating the transition away from fossil fuels. And they're simultaneous. So Europe may be looking to start up some old coal plants, but it's hoping those will only run for a year or so as it accelerates its transition to renewable energy and can then retire the coal plants. China's had a slightly different model. It's actually increased some of its coal recently because of supply and demand constraints, but China's developing renewables faster than any other country in the world. And so the question is, which one wins? Will the demand grow faster than the availability of supply from renewables? If renewables grows faster, China will shut down its coal. And there's an incentive now because of increasing global prices on fossil fuels to do that. But I don't think we know. I'm optimistic that the price increase will drive a more rapid penetration of renewables. We have to think about a couple of pieces. We want to think about security, which is driving many, many countries' concerns. That's economic security and supply stability. We have to think about cost to the consumer. The cost has gone up extraordinarily in most countries around the world because of supply constraints. And we have to think about longevity and reliability of supply when you replace something else. So for example, if we can do a better job at managing grid variability, we'll see a much, much deeper decline in both gas and coal use globally. So I think those are the questions we have to manage.
Shaji, last year at at COP26 in Glasgow, there was a huge, end of session fight over phasing out or phasing down inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. And countries landed on phasing down. Do you think that this year, with this context of the energy crisis and countries, eyeing fossil fuels again in new ways, that we could even get to that wording?
In fact, as the former negotiators, I do not care too much, very much, about the wording, about the language, phase down or phase out. But anyway, I would say we should have deeper and deeper understanding on the process for the transition, for energy transition. Just again, take coal as a major examples. So when we say, oh, we should reduce coal, and then we should think how long, what's the time frame for that. So what's the major determinant for that process? What's the pace, the speed for that? So, for example, talking about the China's process for transition, I would say, oh, this is not something happening in one night. We need 1-2 decades to ensure the smooth, stable, and safe transition. But together with the increase of renewable or non-fossil fuel, etc., and also for fuel itself. So the recent lesson learned from Europe is so number one, let me also coming back to the question from Peking University, Mr. Yang Lei. I mean, what's the implication of the energy crisis? I would say I saw from the media. Germany, they recover some coal-fired power plant, but I would say this is temporary measures, not long-term measures. So it just play a role. I mean, for disaster assessment, treatment, and that means you can leave some capacity, coal-fired power plant capacity, but in normal case, you do not generate electricity with that. But in some very extreme case, you can use that as a backup. That's all. So these will lead to very, very little emission. So this is the lesson learned. But never believe, oh, these will be a long-term trends. In contrast, my understanding is the final way out for energy security is renewable. And I also learned from my European colleagues, they speed up the pace for renewable development. I mean, for 5-year or 10-year time frame. And also, I also saw one very immediate evidence that the export of solar panel from China to Europe, I mean, increased 146% in the past 8 months. So that shows, anyway, we should move to renewable, essentially, for that.
I'm still stuck on your comment that these fights over words don't matter. Phase down, phase out. We can make that.
But let's look back to the market, to the real economy. Yeah. So I mean, for example, in China, if you can ensure, I mean, to control stringently the incremental investment in coal mining, in coal-fired power plant capacity, and then you enlarge your renewable investment, and then your increase of energy or electricity will be covered more and more by renewable. And to this turning point, there will be no need to increase your coal and the coal-fired power plant. So that's the real process.
We have time, unfortunately, for only one more question. Let me take this one from Zhou Zhang. The questioner asks, what's the key piece missing from climate policies on both sides? I think this is a great question. And let's keep in mind the goal the countries have all agreed to, which is to keep global average temperatures from rising beyond 1.5 from pre-industrial levels. We're right now not on track. Nobody is on track to do that. Now that both of you are out of government, what is the if you can boil it down to one thing that you wish your government was doing, that it is not, that it could, what would it be? Zhao, can we start with you?
In short, but certainly I would wish both government, Chinese government and the US government, to keep openness to each other as more as possible. Why? Because climate issue is a global issue. We do need the globalization in terms of trade, technology, finance to address that, to share our technology, to share our ideas, our experience and lesson learned. In that way, we can lower the global cost of abatement, emission abatement. And in that way, we will build up larger and stronger confidence to speed up the agenda of global climate and also to enhance our ambition. So this is my fundamental idea.
Jonathan, what is for you the missing piece in U.S. climate policy? What would you like to see the U.S. doing that is not yet doing?
So I think there's two parts to my answer. The first one is what I'd like to see the U.S. do with China, and the second one, what the U.S. do. On the first part of what it does with China, I would like the U.S. and China to agree that climate change is too important not to take on at the most aggressive possible level. If we look at future damages and risks from climate change, they dwarf almost any other catastrophe we can imagine. I don't think of anything that I've ever seen so far in history that's been the equivalent of 30 million people displaced by one flood. That is one flood in one country before we even get to 1.5 degrees of temperature rise. That is the best it's going to be, not the worst. And for me, if we can't put aside differences and move on this agenda, we're going to have much, much more disaster to come. The second question is, what could the US do individually? And I think that's about implementation. I think the US is going to have to implement the agenda that it's set for itself in order to move to the next level of ambition. Because we should be clear, this gets us a big piece of the way to the 50 to 52, but the 50 to 52 is only part of what we have to do to get to zero. And I think that's a trajectory that requires success on the implementation side.
I want to thank both of you so much for really just a wonderful and important discussion. I hope everyone will give both of our panelists a virtual round of applause, and I would like to invite Juan to give our closing remarks.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, G, Jonathan, and Lisa, for such an engaging conversation. I also want to thank all of you for joining us today, and I hope that you found the conversation as insightful as I did. I would like to invite all of you to the upcoming panel discussion entitled A Humanistic Approach to Climate Change on Tuesday, October 18th at 7 p.m. Central Time, Wednesday, October 19th at 8 a.m. China Standard Time. Thank you very much. Good evening and good day to you.